Welcome back to the 6C. This is our second video in the Devotionals video series, and what I want to do is focus on a couple verses at the end of Exodus chapter 2. And so we're continuing our series through Exodus, and this will be a little bit shorter. I just want to look at a couple verses because there's an amazing insight that we can learn about suffering in our world. So let me just read it to you. At the end of Exodus 2, verses 23 through 25, it says this. It says, "During those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." Now, this is very helpful to us because all of us can identify on some level with the people of Israel. Here they are under slavery. Here they are suffering greatly, feeling the stress and pressure of oppression, and they're crying out to God. I mean, how many of us have felt suffering and frustration, and we have cried out to God in the same way they have for help and for rescue? And it says in the verses that their cry for rescue and for help came up before God, and notice God's reaction. God didn't just, first of all, he heard the prayer, but second of all, he didn't just ignore it. He didn't just turn away from it. He considered it. He thought about it, and what he did was he remembered a covenant or a promise that he had made with Abraham that eventually he would bless the world through a coming Savior. And so it also says not only did he hear their prayers, that he remembered the covenant, but he knew, meaning he knew their issues, their problems, their sufferings. He identified with them. He loved them. Now, it's interesting to pull back from this and just see what's going on here. Though the people of Israel cried out to God for help, their help did not immediately come. And think about that in our own lives. Often we will pray to God for help in the midst of our suffering, and we will not be immediately rescued from it. And often we then start crying out or complaining that God is not hearing us, that God does not care, that God has other plans and agendas, and he's just not caring and looking after us. But we have to remember from this verse, the application we can take is that though God did not immediately rescue them, he had a greater plan of rescue, but it couldn't take place just then. He had to prepare a rescuer. And so he is honoring his commitment to Abraham, and he's also honoring his commitment to those people to take care of them by raising up Moses. And so in order to raise up Moses, it would take many years of him to teach and to lead Moses to be the man that God wanted him to be. And so it would mean that the people of Israel would have to stay in suffering for a time in order for God's bigger plans to take place. Now, often when we face suffering and struggle, it can force us to become very self-centered, where we just think about our lives and how we're going to get out of suffering and how much we need relief from pain. But what the Bible is calling us to in these passages specifically is telling us is to become God-centered, to become gospel-centered. Because what God is doing here is he's going to rescue not just the people of Israel, he is going to offer rescue to the whole world. And so he has a greater plan at work than just the comfort of his people. And so we have to remember that as well as we go through suffering, that God has a much bigger plan that doesn't just involve us. It involves all of the peoples of this world, and that it might be through our suffering that God uses that to save and to rescue hundreds and thousands of other people. So this passage challenges us, convicts us, and tells us to have a God-centered perspective on suffering and on the brokenness of this world. Ultimately, God will bring all suffering to an end. He will bring all injustice to punishment and to justice, and he will do that first by showing us the cross and how through Christ's death he's making all sin right and forgiving and cleansing all the world of brokenness, and when he returns he will bring final justice. So in between that time, between the time of the cross and between the time of Jesus' return, we will experience brokenness, we will experience suffering, we will experience slavery and oppression. And in the midst of that, God does not promise to rescue us from it. He promises to be with us in the midst of it, and that there is a time coming when all the suffering, oppression, and brokenness of this world will be taken care of. So I hope this helps us to see a bigger picture of the gospel, helps us to think differently about our suffering and our situation, and to give us a bigger picture of the gospel, a God-centered view of suffering, and a Jesus-loving and exalting view of life.